Okay, I will get us started today. So welcome everyone to today's DEFI webinar, The Future of Work, Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning in Education. My name is Kevin Martin, Center Manager for DEFI, Digital Education Futures Initiative at Hughes Hall, Cambridge. DEFI exists to creatively explore the possibilities that digital technology opens up for education, with a vision to create a more inclusive global education system by building a community that offers a space for open dialogue, research, reflection, and thought leadership on digital education's role in shaping a sustainable future. In today's webinar, we will promote this vision by looking at the possibilities and also the challenges of bringing advanced technologies into education and the world of work. We have an excellent group of panelists speaking across a range of perspectives today, and the discussion will be future-oriented and thought-provoking. Before I introduce today's panelists, I have a few comments regarding the structure of the webinar and DEFI updates. Many of you have given permission to share your contact details with the other registrants. You can download the registrant list from the chat box. We encourage you to use this list to keep the conversation going after today's program. And thank you for the fantastic questions submitted in advance of today's webinar. We look forward to many more during the session. If you think of a question for our panelists, please put it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And the chat facility is also available for networking and open discussion. DEFI is also pleased to announce that our new Future Skills Scoping Review has just been published this week. As a participant in today's webinar on the future of work, we think you'll be very interested to read this paper. Members of the DEFI Innovation Lab utilized thematic analysis and social network analysis of 99 separate frameworks to develop meta-categories representing clusters of future skills reported by extant research. The review is one of 3 articles by DEFI researchers published in this latest issue of Irish Educational Studies. And DEFI Director Rupert Weggriff was a guest editor. Please use the second link to access the full issue. And now to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. First, Riikka Hofmann will be speaking to us. She is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education, Cambridge, where she leads the research strand Dialogue, Professional Change and Leadership in the faculty's Cambridge Educational Dialogue Research Group, known as CEDAR. She holds the title of Docent in Psychology of Education at the University of Helsinki and is co-founder of Cambridge University Medical Education Group. She studies change efforts in both education and healthcare settings, and through her policy work also investigates implications in policy contexts in the wider social policy field. Next, Elizabeth Polding will be speaking to us. Liz conducts research comparing existing and new routes into legal practice, with a particular focus on solicitor apprenticeships. She began her career at Her Majesty's Customs and Excise before qualifying as a lawyer to pursue her interest in tax law more effectively. She qualified as a solicitor and worked both in private practice and in-house with PricewaterhouseCoopers before teaching law at the Oxford Institute of Legal Practice and BPP University in Bristol. Liz is an author for Oxford University Press and served for many years as a course validation panel member and an external examiner for the Solicitors Regulation Authority and for a number of providers of legal education. And our last panelist for today is Wayne Holmes, who holds a PhD from the University of Oxford, is a learning sciences and innovation researcher teaching at University College London, a consultant researcher on artificial intelligence and education for UNESCO, and a member of the Education Scientific Committee for the International Research Center for Artificial Intelligence. Having been involved in education throughout his life, Wayne takes a critical studies approach to the connections between AI and education and their ethical and social implications. His recent publications include the 2019 article, Artificial Intelligence and Education, Promise and Implications for Teaching and Learning, and the 2021 article, Ethics of AI in Education, Towards a Community-Wide Framework. He has given invited talks about AI in education to teachers, researchers, and policymakers in countries around the world. And DEFI is very fortunate to have this esteemed group of panelists speaking to us today. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Hofmann to start her presentation.
Thank you, Kevin, and Welcome, everyone. Kevin, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can, Riikka.
It's great to be here with you today. Back 20 years ago, exactly, I was an MPhil student and a research assistant working at the University of Helsinki in a research project that was aiming to create a virtual university. And my MPhil dissertation looked at how we can create a virtual university in which various technologies support the learning of diverse students and different learners. It's quite interesting that actually took a global pandemic in the context that I'm working in to move us into a virtual university. And at this point, all that I can tell is students and colleagues are all desperate to move back away from this virtual university into being together in a room again. And yet the key thing that we all want is to be able to learn from this experience and really use it as what it really was, from an educational perspective, a huge naturalistic experiment on what happens when we're having to use technology in education in ways that we hadn't before. How can we move back to having the best benefits of being in person, in the classroom, in educational settings, but without losing the good bits, really looking at technology-enhanced learning. Actually, since my MPhil dissertation, my work has not engaged with technology for many, many years after that. I'm a learning scientist. My research looks at professional learning and particularly the capacity of professional development interventions to change professional practice in the workplace and the mechanisms by which that kind of change can happen. And it's in this context that my work has led me to looking at simulations, both in educational settings, in teacher education, teacher professional development, and in medical and healthcare education and professional development, working closely with the NHS in particular. With simulations, we can mean a whole range of educational approaches in which a professional practice is somehow evoked, an as if professional practice, either in its full form, in a simplified form, in a stepwise form, which enables people to take part in practicing that target professional practice without everything that comes with doing it in the real world. In particular, in my current research, the technology that my current research program is looking at is a technology called the HoloLens, which is a technology, a lens, literally speaking, that allows us to project a virtual patient with whatever characteristics we have coded into that virtual patient in front of us in a virtual room in which the rest of us may or may not be physically present. Some of this is actually quite futuristic. It's quite a nice and exciting thing. And later on, I'm quite happy to send you links to some videos of some of the prototypes that we are currently developing with our technology partner in the US and that we will be evaluating. Now, I came to the word of evaluating it. Actually, while there is huge promise in these kinds of novel technologies in supporting learning through simulations, the evidence base for their effectiveness is actually very, very weak. There are lots of studies out there, but a lot of them are methodologically not particularly strong. They don't have strong research designs. They don't use strong methods. They don't use strong instruments in assessing learning outcomes. And it's something that my research program really wants to look at. But what I want to do in today's short talk is really take a little bit of a step back and introduce some key questions that from my perspective are really relevant for us to implement this kind of technology in best ways to work for us as a tool and not as a master. And when I say work for us as a tool, I mean that on two levels. Work for us as a tool in a pragmatic sense. What is it that this technology can do for us that we are already wanting to achieve? And it might help us achieve it better. And I also mean using technology as a tool, as an epistemic tool. How can we use technology to help us envision new kinds of futures of work, learning, and our wider lives that we might not have been able to imagine as objectives or learning outcomes if we hadn't been using this technology to think with? I'm staying mainly with the pragmatic level for my talk today, but want to have this kind of epistemic background all the time in the background, thinking, how can we use this technology to expand our thinking, expand our cognition, expand our ability to envision alternative futures? So the first one of the three questions that I want to suggest we want to be thinking about in relation to how such technologies can help professional learning, in my case, is why are we using it? Seems a bit of an obvious question, but actually there is a lot of nuance in the different answers that we might want to think through. Are we using it in my setting, for example, sometimes to help medics or healthcare professionals practice things that are too risky for them to practice for the first time with real patients? Are we using it because we are wanting to let people practice things that are too rare in the real life, so we can't expect people to encounter those in their everyday practice? Things that are too unpredictable, so they might happen quite often, but in clusters, so if somebody goes and trains for a month, they might not come across them. Things that are ethically challenging. Or do we want to use technology to try and help people practice things that are hard to see, that are hard for us to notice, such as things to do with discrimination and implicit bias, which we know to be huge challenges in education and in healthcare alike? Or do we want to use them to help us teach things that are either inaccessible or too expensive to teach at scale in our current system? So the technology might provide us a solution where we might bring that knowledge and make it accessible to a wider range of practitioners and learners. When we're trying to generate evidence for effectiveness, it's really key that we are asking this question, why? Because these questions and these purposes for our use of such technology lead to different research questions and different research designs. Are we wanting to compare whether our technology enhanced simulation is better than traditional teaching? Are we wanting to compare if it's better than some more advanced technology, which however is not affordable for us, as good but more accessible, cheaper, adding something good for different people, good for learners, or might it allow us to do something we were completely not able to do in the past? We also need to think about how this technology could work as an epistemic tool, as I mentioned, to help us think of completely new learning objectives that we might have not considered realistic in the past. Secondly, if we want to make the technology work for us both as a pragmatic and an epistemic tool, the question we want to be asking is not just what the technology can do for us, but what real life problems and gaps we want to address and resolve. And to ask these questions requires that we're really thinking about gaps in our current provision. So one of the things that was surprising in research that we've conducted recently is to prepare for this project with the HoloLens augmented reality simulations. We conducted a scoping review that looked at research technology enhanced simulations in healthcare education that had taken place in the last couple of years. And we looked at what kind of learning outcomes had been aimed at in those technology enhanced simulations. And one of the surprises that came out, just as an example of that research, one thing that we know to be a huge challenge in our healthcare system at the moment are issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion, both relating to patients and in relating to staff working in the healthcare system. Issues around discrimination, lack of trust, poorer care, perceived poorer care. However, none of the studies we looked at in technology enhanced simulations aimed at any learning outcomes relating to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's really quite surprising because when we talk about the HoloLens technology, for example, which can project a virtual patient into a room for us to interact with as learners, it would not take very much to change the ways of the kind of patient we are interacting with. We can change the patient's gender, we can change their race and ethnicity, the kind of accent they speak with, are they English as another language speaker, you know, do they have a strong working class accent? All those kinds of things could be easily varied to help us come and see how implicit bias and discrimination actually work in practice in ways that none of us want to do, but we know it happens all the time. Yet that was not something that was part of any of the research studies that we look at. So if we are not thinking critically and innovatively about our current professional practice and training and the shortcomings of our current practice and training, we'll come nowhere near to realizing the full potential of these new tools. And finally, but I'm not going to go into this, but I just wanted to highlight the third question that we really need to be asking, thinking about this technology, is how people learn. You will recognize this phrase from the US book that's very famous that guided the development of programs of research and practice in the learning sciences in the US several years ago now. The question we really want to be asking is not just how do people learn, but how do diverse people learn? One of the key findings that's come out by my collaborators in recent years on technology-enhanced simulation-based learning of professional teachers, healthcare professionals, other professionals, is that different learning mechanisms support the learning of higher education students with higher or lower levels of prior knowledge. And not only is their learning supported by different scaffolding mechanisms, but the scaffolds that support the learning of students with high prior knowledge can actually be detrimental to students with lower prior knowledge. Those kinds of learning mechanisms are absolutely key to an effective design of technology-enhanced simulations and other learning environments, so that we can capitalize on using the technology to equalize learning and not make it even more unequal than it has been in the past. So I think I'm going to stop here. I will very much welcome your questions and conversations with yourselves later on, and I'm very much looking forward to my panelists' contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hofmann, and I encourage all of you, if you have questions on what Dr. Hofmann just said, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now I will invite Elizabeth Polding to participate.
I do have some slides. I will try and share my screen with you. Okay. Okay, can you see my slides? Are they my minimalist slides?
We can.
Good, excellent. Okay, so I thank you very much, Riikka. That was really interesting. And actually, some of the questions that you were talking about there are very much under consideration in my field. So my field is legal professional education. At the moment, I'm looking at apprenticeships, but I've been teaching in higher education, having practiced as a lawyer for more years than I care to remember. And one of the things that has been very much at the forefront of how we're thinking about legal professional education, which is, after all, intended to prepare people to practice, is new ideas about what it actually means to be a lawyer. And in particular, the work of Richard Susskind, and I'll share a couple of links in the chat a little bit later on to some very interesting stuff by Richard Susskind. So essentially, the Solicitors Regulation Authority published a report in 2021, which said that 37% of law firms were using legal technology in some form in 2021, and a further 24% were planning on doing so. Now, Suskind's ideas in his 2013 book, Tomorrow's Lawyers, hence the title of the slide, see what I did there, basically, what he was saying was that actually law in the next 20 years is going to change far more than it has in 2 centuries. And when he republished his second edition in 2017, he said, yeah, we're on track. The idea behind that was that actually technology would mean that we would probably need fewer lawyers, and also that we would be able to do more of what was described as horizontal disaggregation. So horizontal disaggregation assumes that at the bottom, the purely process-driven stuff, we can kind of delegate that to AI in particular. So going through documents, the sort of things that I used to do as a trainee, except that mine were paper documents in windowless rooms. Not everybody's favorite task. So that kind of stuff can be outsourced, and you didn't necessarily need legal input at that stage. And Susskind also referred to this idea that actually lawyers would be redeployed and that they would be doing things which required more human capabilities. So becoming a trusted advisor, relating to your client, building relationships, those sorts of things. In terms of information, because lawyers deal with huge quantities of information, he effectively said that we would be, quote, outgunned by superior processing power in relation to AI. So we wouldn't necessarily become obsolete, but we would almost certainly have to kind of shift the way we practiced. So in terms of what's happening, according to the SRA's report and according to my own experience of talking to clients, is that, yes, we are using technology in legal practice more. And we are using AI for things like data management, which has meant that, for example, one of the things that I taught when I started my DEFI was transactions, so acquisitions of companies and businesses. And we used to give students paper documents to have a look at. We then moved to virtual data rooms, and now a lot of that is being handled by AI packages. So legal technology is advancing at a fairly kind of rapid pace. However, it hasn't quite gone the way that was originally envisaged. So the kind of horizontal disaggregation that Susskind described, actually that's being touched on again, because it seems that actually you do need legal input at all of those stages. And there needs to be a combination of technology, administration, and legal expertise at pretty much all levels. So one example, conveyancing. Conveyancing tends to be the kind of work where you do have a lot of low-level processes, but you still need that legal input. So if, for example, you can't necessarily interpret what it means when you have a map that shows that there doesn't appear to be any access, you need the legal input to go, okay, yes, we need to sort that out. There's no reason why AI shouldn't deal with that, but there's still legal input there. So that's all kind of up for grabs. It's all shifting a little bit. We're still embracing AI, legal tech, but not quite in the same way. So Susskind refers in a more recent paper to this idea of virtual disaggregation. So you've got essentially legal expertise involved at all stages. So in terms of what's happening in regard to legal professional education, how is it responding? It's probably worth giving a very brief bit of context here. Legal education has recently changed tremendously. I was one of the first people to take the legal practice course years ago. And that's now been replaced as after September 2021 by something called the Solicitor's Qualification Exam. And essentially what's happening there is that there won't be any regulated courses. We've always been heavily regulated in terms of how legal professional education is offered. There will be a centralized examination system. So everything has changed tremendously. Now, when we had the legal practice course, that had attendance elements. So it made it quite difficult to offer those courses online. And it also made the way that they could be taught. There was flexibility, certainly, but not nearly as much as we have now. So the door is wide open to start thinking, could we do this in a different way? What do employers want? How can we prepare students better for an environment in which they are going to be using legal technology, they are going to be kind of using that sort of tech in their work, and they are going to need to have that incorporated into the process of legal professional education as well. Now, this is probably not the time or the place to get into the digital natives debate. There are various viewpoints on that. And students still tend to feel that purely online courses, they're not entirely sure about that, but they are certainly getting more comfortable with technology. So in terms of how that's working, two very brief examples. BPP, obviously I've taught at BPP. The way that AI is being used is to allow for a more personalized experience. So not only are students being kind of acclimatized to this idea that actually AI is something that they are going to come across throughout their professional careers, but it does allow for a more tailored experience. And I think the point that Riikka made about why are we using this technology, there is this tremendous temptation to think we've got to use this technology, and for things to be technology driven rather than for them to be pedagogically driven. So in legal professional education, there are two big reasons why we would be doing this. First of all, because actually it's pedagogically sound to provide a tailored experience, and also because it's helping to prepare students better for the work environment. Barbary, in contrast, also using AI as part of their education experience. They've called it Isaac, which I kind of like. But their model, unlike sort of a classroom, a law school idea, they are legal exam preparation experts. So their approach is slightly different. But again, using this because it's pedagogically sound and it prepares students better for the kind of environment they're going to move into. So in conclusion, yes, everything is changing. The legal landscape is changing. The legal professional education landscape is changing. But AI hasn't quite worked in the way that we thought. The idea originally was that AI would make lawyers obsolete. It hasn't necessarily done that, but it is definitely being incorporated into legal practice, albeit in a slightly different way. Students are confident with technology generally, but there is still going to be a learning curve, which is why some institutions, so the University of Law, BBP, are actually offering specific training in relation to the use of legal technology, including AI. The opening up of legal professional education, some of the deregulation is allowing employers to have much more input into how those courses work. So law schools are basically responding, first of all, to the opportunity that they've been given by this deregulation, but also to what employers are telling them about what students need to understand. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Liz. That was really fascinating. And again, I encourage our attendees today to post any questions that you have for either of the two speakers who have gone to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And next, we will have Wayne Holmes join us. So Wayne, you are welcome to start.
Thank you. If I may, I'll just share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen.
We can.
Great. So thank you very much to everyone at DEFI for inviting me today. It is much appreciated. And I've really enjoyed the two contributions so far. And I'm going to agree with a lot of it, and I'm going to disagree with some of it. So the reality is that when we watch a lot of presentations about AI, we're often told mainly about the good stuff. So I kind of see my job as attempting to redress the balance, which is why I refer to my work as taking a critical studies perspective on AI and education, and tonight in terms of its potential impact on the future of work. So to begin with, I think of AI and education as being in three buckets. There are multiple connections, and it's very useful, I think, to break these connections down, to think of them separately. But the reality is, like any categorization, there's lots of overlaps and confusions, hence the picture of the platypus here. But anyway, I think of AI and education in terms of three buckets. My first bucket I refer to as learning with AI. And in a sense, this is what we've heard a great deal about today. This is student supporting or teacher supporting or system supporting. In fact, the vast majority of learning with AI tools are in the student supporting category. And in fact, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry already. However, as has also been mentioned already today, there's very little robust evidence for its efficacy. And I would argue that actually most of it pretty much automates what I call poor pedagogic practices. So to give you one example of that, and this is something that has already been mentioned, is the notion of personalized learning. So the idea is that these AI tools, these AI tutors, personalize learning for each of the individual students who are engaging. And by adapting, what they're given, the information they're given, the activities they're given, in response to their interactions with the system. So each individual student They get their own individual pathway through the material to be learned. But for me, this is a really poor understanding of what personalization is, because although they might all get their own personalized pathways, the ambition tends to be to take them all to the same fixed learning outcomes. So it's all about actually words like efficiency and scale come into play, rather than the realities of anything to do with personalization. And, personalization of learning has been something that's been claimed of technology for the past 100 years, and it's not happened yet. But, maybe AI will do something different. But let me give you a metaphor, which is GPS and route planning software. Now, I don't know about you, but, I use this all the time, and particularly when I'm visiting a city that I don't know anything about, and I find it really, really helpful as we navigate our way around. But the reality is there's now evidence that people, the study says, who have greater GPS experience actually have worse spatial memory during self-guided navigation. So not only potentially do these AI devices in classrooms narrow students' learning, it might also impact negatively on their cognitive development. The reality is at the moment we really just don't know. So this is really what these tools should be using if we are going to use them. They should be aiming at individualized outcomes, self-actualization, helping learners achieve their own personal aims and potential, all of which will help them in their futures when they leave school, when they leave university, and go into the world of work so that they can actually contribute most effectively. The reality is that no existing AI tool does anything like that. None that I'm aware of. But it doesn't have to be like this. So developing and using AI is all about making choices. And we have to think very carefully about what we want to achieve. As we mentioned this evening, it's not just about let's put AI in there, it'll sort things. We need to think about what are the aims that we're trying to achieve and how we might get there, and aiming at ways for the common good. So that learning with AI is where most of the efforts have been in the AI and education community over the past 30 years. But the other area that's becoming increasingly important is learning about AI. And again, this has an impact, I would argue, on people when they're leaving the world of education to join the world of work and other things. So learning about AI, we're talking about how AI works, how to create it, the techniques, the technologies, and so on. And there's a bunch of stuff out there. So some of you might be aware of this, which is from Finland. It's called Elements of AI. And it's an online course that takes you through various things. It's interesting. It's been designed by a computer scientist. So as an educator, I find it quite problematic at times. But they have first mover advantage, and they've done really well. But as well as that, of course, in lots of universities, including my university, UCL, the university I did my PhD, Oxford, Cambridge University, there are hundreds of courses teaching people various elements about how to create and develop AI. In many, many different ways. There are also various initiatives trying to help young people learn about AI. So this is one in the US, AI for K-12 initiative, and they're trying to develop a curriculum for US schools which focuses on these five areas, these five big ideas: AI and perception, representation and reasoning, learning, natural interaction, and societal impact. So there's an awful lot going on here. But what about my third bucket? My third bucket I tend to call preparing for AI, talking about living with AI, human values, ethics. And what does it mean to live in this world where AI is increasingly around us? And how do we ensure that the AI actually aligns with human values? And what potentially are the ethical consequences? But I've talked about two buckets there, and really they kind of go together. Because I don't believe we should be teaching one without the other. So the distinction is perhaps less than helpful, because for me, the teaching of AI should include both the technical and the human dimensions interwoven throughout. AI is unlike other earlier technologies in this way that it both depends very, very closely on what humans do to make it work in the first place, but it has such profound potential implications. Give you one example of that: face recognition. So this is a famous example from Amazon. So the system trying to identify people like me, males, lighter skin, pretty accurate. Men with darker skin, not quite so good. Women with lighter skin, getting worse. And women with darker skin, really quite appalling. But then you might argue, well, this is just the maturity of the tech. And actually, as it gets developed, it'll get better. And I'm sure since this was this study happened, it has got better. But actually, that still begs a really big question: whether face recognition should be used widely at all. We also have lots of myths centered on AI that we should also be talking about, such as this notion that AI, when COVID happened, everybody got excited and thought this is the time when AI is really going to come to the fore and help us challenge things. But the reality is, as it says here, none of the models identify potential clinical use. So the reality is that AI contributed very little. This was one meta-analysis. There were several others. And it's not just for COVID, but for things like detecting breast cancers, where again, the AI has not fulfilled what was promised. And we have companies like IBM spending millions of dollars developing their AI for healthcare departments, and have shut those down now because they can't make it work. Another problem that's often missed, this is definitely worth mentioning, is the increased centralization of AI expertise, AI data, and therefore power. And so when they're getting the situation where AI companies, particularly the big tech on the screen here around the world, have actually more power and more regulatory authority than most national governments. These are the kind of things that really should be thought about quite carefully. So in conclusion, our whole reliance means that there are many, many challenges. AI tools might help some students learn some things, but I would argue it isn't as smart as many people say it is. Rather than enabling students to self-actualize, to prepare them for their future, AI tools actually narrow what and how students learn. AI literacy, in my opinion, should involve both the technical and the human dimensions. And AI, in the way we use it, is a set of choices. So we've heard one example today of using AI in simulations. That's quite different to the kind of materials I've been talking about and been more critical of. But it's choices like this, and we have to make sure that we're making right choices. And as I finish there, the power of AI being accumulated. But there are other issues: the unknown impact of AI on human cognition, the use of language that gives AI an agency that it doesn't really have, AI as a tool of surveillance capitalism, AI and unintended consequences, AI and the realignment of jobs. It goes on and on. Lots of things there that we need to be thinking about. But that's me for now. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you, Liz and Riikka. So we will now start our question and answer period. And our attendees, again, if you have a question, please post it to the question and answer box. But I will start with a question that we did get from an attendee that Riikka answered, and perhaps Liz and Wayne might be able to expand on it more. But we heard some great examples of AI in professional practices, so medical training and legal training. And one of our attendees raises the question of the role AI has in traditional classroom teaching. And I took that to mean, say, primary and secondary school education.
Well, should I go first? So most of the tools that I'm aware of are designed for secondary education. A lot of it now moving into primary, and limited amounts into tertiary and vocational. it's often you go to a conference and you listen to one of the companies, and as there are almost 100 multi-million-dollar companies around the world offering this kind of tech now. And when they start speaking, they will always say, the teacher is the most important person here. And we really value the teacher. They spend, a good 30 seconds explaining that. And then they spend 29 minutes and 30 seconds explaining their tech, which effectively replaces the teacher. That's what they've designed. That's what they're aiming to achieve. So in the school classroom, and that's where most of this tech is being pushed at the moment, and it's being taken up by policymakers because it sounds really sexy, and it sounds like they're really doing their job if they get this tech into the classrooms. But the reality is there's no efficacy evidence that it actually works. It embodies poor pedagogic practices. It disempowers teachers. It adds to the Matthew effect because there are some children who just don't have access to the technology or the internet, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not saying AI doesn't have a role here. I think it does have a role. I think the current way that it's being used is really problematic, and we need to continue to engage and question and try and break this apart as best we can.
Sorry, go ahead, Riikka. Yeah.
Shall I follow from that? So I very much concur with what Wayne has said, and there is, like I was saying earlier in my presentation, is that when we often jump over the question of why we are using the technology and what is the real life valuable problem that we're wanting to address, then we end up using the technology for something it can do, which often is not just neutral from the perspective of those real life valuable problems, but actually detrimental to those. I mean, one of the classic is not even AI, it's very simple technology, but it has the same kind of effect than what Wayne's talked about, is these students now doing their maths homework on these adaptive websites instead of using a book. And what happens is if you give wrong answers, it gives you easier tasks. But when did we want to live in a world where children don't know that they are not even having a chance to have a go at the more difficult tasks? Whereas I've spoken to lots of kids who do really well at maths, and they realize that as long as they keep giving the right answer, they just get given more tasks. So all they need to do is do really badly a couple of rounds and they get less homework. Now, it's a caricature, but at the same time, it's completely real. This scenario is playing out in hundreds of thousands of secondary schools, around us all the time. So I think one of the really key things is exactly, first of all, what do we think is valuable? What do we want to achieve? And how do we relate what people do with the technology, with the real world? So I mentioned in the Q&A, one of the things that we've looked at in research of collaborators of mine that I've been involved in is using automatic adaptive feedback in text-based simulations to help student teachers practice diagnosing students' learning difficulties. So they can look at lots of scenarios, they can look at data, assessment data, reports from parents, interviews with students, and then they can try and figure out what kind of learning challenge might the student have and get adaptive feedback, which gives them the chance to practice more at scale. But we need to always be asking the question of, are we narrowing down? Is this actually helping people in the real world rather than treating it as a goal on its own right? I mean, I could make some further comments, but I think I'll hand over to Liz because I'm sure she'll have valuable contributions.
Well, it's difficult to follow that, what you and Wayne have just said. I think the key thing for me in terms of the deployment of AI in the education process is the process, because actually education isn't just about information transfer. It is about a lot more than that. And I think if the pandemic has done anything, it's demonstrated that actually education is about more than just information transfer. It's an experiential thing, the development of emotional intelligence, all of those things, and also things which are sort of fall in and out of policy fashion, like creativity. So I do worry that, I think Wayne makes a good point, that this idea that, you know, AI can do, we still value the teacher, but here's something which is effectively replacing the teacher. I do have concerns about that, because it does seem to solve a tremendous number of problems. It does seem to make things more efficient, more effective, and there does seem to be, well, it's the point that Wayne made earlier about using kind of GPS technology, but becoming less spatially aware. I think there has to be a bit of a balance there. So I'm not sure how much I've actually added there, and Wayne's clearly got points to contribute over and above that.
Well, yeah, I was only going to, two things. One, I was just interested, you mentioned it does lots of really good things in the classroom. You said efficient and effective, and I don't have any evidence of that, and I've been researching this for a long time. So I think that is what lots of people think, and lots of people hope. There's lots of aspiration in this direction, but there's not a lot of evidence to support it. But what I thought I would do, I should redress the balance again and actually talk for a moment about an AI tool that I think is fantastic. And this actually comes from Beijing in China, and it's a tool called the Smart Learning Partner. Now, the tool I'm talking about is actually only a very small part of what they do, but I really like it. It's an app that the students have on their phones. And if a student comes out of a classroom and they've not understood something, or they want to clarify something, they use the app and they punch in the question, you know, what is differential calculus, or I don't understand this, whatever it might be. And boom, it brings up a list of human tutors, the names of human tutors. And each of these human tutors, like a dating app, has been rated by other students who have used this tool. And so you can get and comment, so this tutor was really helpful, whatever. And so they then can choose the human tutor, and they then get I think 20 minutes of one-to-one tuition, where they can share the screen, they can share voice, but for safety, they don't share video. And the reason I like this is because this is the student taking control. I need support, and it's the AI is being used to help them find the best support. But the support is not being given by an AI tool, it's been given by a human. And so we're using actually quite simple AI to do something which I think is quite profound, to connect teachers and humans together, so students and human tutors together, so that the learning can happen. Yeah, so that's using simple tech to do something profound, rather than really complex tech to do something that's perhaps not that useful.
Riikka, please go ahead.
My comment is to Mike's question in the chat indirectly, but if we want to stay with this topic, I'm happy to wait.
Liz, was your response to what Wayne was saying?
Yes, it was. I think, just very briefly, the examples that I shared of how AI is being used in legal professional education, there is recourse to a tutor, as there should be, and certainly this is something that I did experiment way back when this was all a bit steam driven in the early 2000s, and ultimately the resource was, okay, if you've gone through these extra exercises and it's still not making sense, it's your tutor. You need to speak to your tutor, and that was incorporated into the process. And I completely agree with Wayne. There shouldn't be a situation where AI is all you got. Essentially, there should be a human element to that.
Thank you, Liz. And Riikka, you were going to respond to Mike Meany's question, which is certainly related to the topics that we're discussing here, and the drive towards using AI to reconsider existing failures in the system. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, firstly, I wanted to really concur with Wayne's point. Certainly in my field, looking at professional development, professional education, the evidence base is incredibly weak. And one of the problems is that we actually have lots and lots of research studies, certainly in my field, but they're not highly rigorous research studies. So there is a sense of having lots of evidence, but it's not very rigorous evidence, and that really is an enormous gap. But then going back to kind of Mike's point and also Wayne's presentation, I wonder, linking that to a point that I made earlier, whether there is a fourth bucket, Wayne, to what you presented, and it may be that it's, you know, it coincides with one of your buckets. I mentioned about having the kind of pragmatic dimension of how can we use this kind of technology to address issues and challenges and current gaps that we think are important. But then I also mentioned about the epistemic dimension of using it to think with, for us to think with the technology to help us uncover challenges that we face that we haven't yet fully captured or articulated or even come to see. And just use an example there, it's a completely different use of technology, but nonetheless, the technology is actually relevant to be able to do this. So one of the things that I do in my teaching of research methods in higher education is what I call cognitive simulations. So evoking certain types of thinking to help us use tools to learn, help us to see the world in new ways. So for example, in my work, we look at virtual reality and augmented reality simulations enabled through technology. But in order to be able to generate such a simulation, through technology, we have to define what are the characteristics of that authentic practice. What are its components? How do they work with one another? It sounds like a very obvious task for a professional in that particular field. It really, really isn't. Are we going to be purposefully replicating, for example, the discriminative features of practice that we know to exist, or do we not know that they exist, but we accidentally replicate them? So really using the technology as a tool to ask us some really, really critical questions that are hard for us to think through if we aren't actually able to create that. Similarly with machine learning, one of the things that I do with my students who may be here is I ask them to Google things like party and riot, and look at the results that when we Google party, many of us get, and choose images, many of us get images that have a lot of white people waving their arms up in the air. And if we, you know, we Google something like riot, we may get a picture of a lot of people who are not white waving their hands in the air. So then we are thinking, you know, this gives us a bit of an idea why machine learning ends up replicating the discriminative features of our culture. It's not because it's thinking for itself, it's because it's taking in everything that exists and it can process it more efficiently than we can. So it's also thinking about how we can use this kind of technology as a tool to think with, rather than as a tool to do something for us instead of what we used to do in the past. Not sure that's a fourth bucket, Wayne, but that's a thought I had.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement, Riikka. I think that's really cool stuff. And I just wanted to give an example of something that I think chimes with this. So examinations. I loathe examinations. I think they have no validity. They're useless. They don't do what they say they do. They add to mental health issues. Personally, I did really badly at exams at school, so it took me 20 years to get into academia, unlike other people just kind of smooth their way through. So I don't think examinations work. Now, don't get me wrong, I like assessment. I believe in accreditation. It's examinations, the 3-hour, you may turn your paper over now type situation. So given I hate examinations, when I first came across AI and AI use in classrooms, etc., I thought, well, hey, hang on a second. Maybe we can use the AI to monitor what's going on in the classroom so that we don't need to have examinations. And actually, the AI tool can develop over time a richer, more nuanced profile of the individual student. And then one day, rather belatedly, unfortunately, I woke up and realized I was actually advocating surveillance in classrooms, and I dislike surveillance in classrooms as much as I dislike exams. So then I'm stuck. What do I do now? And then I went to a school in the Midlands, in just in a deprived area of Birmingham, and they were doing something really cool. And I think this is something I would love to research more properly. So each teacher had an iPad or similar, and on the iPad was at the top of the iPad screen was a particular competency, the competency of the day. And on the screen were icons representing all the children. And while the children were working, doing their 10-minute work with their textbook or whatever, the teacher was just looking around the class and saying, okay, Liz, green, Kevin, red, Riikka, amber, Barry, green, and boom, 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 really quickly. Now, what I like about that is it's drawing on the teacher's expertise, the teacher's knowledge of that student, the teacher's knowledge of the curriculum, the teacher's knowledge of what they did yesterday, the teacher's knowledge of what the child has experienced in their home life over the past few days. All of that together and their tacit knowledge all in that one quick moment. Now, of course, just taking that one data point is useless, but we could have an AI tool in the background that is normalizing, that is proposing the particular competency for the day, that's normalizing the teacher over time, normalizing between teachers, normalizing between schools. And at the end of the day, it could generate some kind of profile of the individual students. So that, I think, Riikka, is an example, I hope that you agree, of where we take a problem. How do we assess and accredit students? How can we leverage the amazing things that modern technologies can do to innovate how we assess and accredit, rather than just reproducing a process that was invented in China 1,000 years ago and we're still doing it today? And so, yeah, that for me is doing this, finding a real problem, and how can we use the technology to address it in a more innovative, exciting way, taking account, of course, of issues such as diversity, inclusivity, and so on and so forth.
Liz, please go ahead.
Thank you. I put a link in the chat to a ResearchGate publication by somebody that I've collaborated with on some other things, which is, we've had a few references to this idea of simulations. So this was one of the earliest examples, the Ardcalach project. And essentially Ardcalach is a virtual town, and it was used in the Glasgow Graduate School of Law initially to allow students to kind of form their own virtual law firms and perform tasks and interact with tutors as though they were clients. So it was quite an ambitious project. It's well worth a look, actually. It's quite an interesting experiment. And that was also used for assessment, because when you're teaching students who are going to go on to be lawyers, in this case, they're going to go on to be admitted to the Law Society of Scotland, you need to teach them how to practice law. And you can teach them how to practice law by getting them to practice law. So they were working in law firms, they were team working, they were responding to clients' letters, they were conducting virtual court cases, virtual property transactions. And it was just a really interesting way. And it picks up on some of the points that we were looking at earlier about getting people to replicate this experience. But it was a really interesting approach, and it was actually used for assessment. Because preparing you to do a job by assessing you on how well you do the job seems fairly aligned. So I just thought that was an interesting one to look at.
Thank you, Liz. So we've talked about assessment and training. We've had a very critical look at AI and the potential shortcomings. But we have a question from Pam Bernard that was submitted to the panelists that will take us in a slightly different direction. And Pam asks about the role of AI in creativity, specifically asks for studies that you or others have conducted where you report on AI creativity and human creativity, co-authoring these new forms of creativity. And so I think our attendees would be really interested in hearing that aspect of AI and how it's supporting those new ways of thinking. Yes, Wayne.
Thank you. I think it's a really, really interesting question. It makes me smile a great deal. I would argue that AI does not have creativity. So that's dealt with that question. What has the creativity are the people who have created the AI in the first place. You know, to create, we've seen examples of things like GPT-3 creating pieces of writing and poems. We've seen other systems that create paintings. And it's as if we're assuming that the AI did all this. Well, the AI didn't do all this. This took hundreds upon hundreds of person hours to develop the algorithms, to look at what is whatever is whatever, and to make those kind of judgments. So it's this part of this myth that the AI is doing it, but it's the myth that's being perpetrated by the people who are running these tools. I think two things about them, though. I think they are fascinating in one respect. And this goes back to Mike Meany's question as well, I think, because if we use in a classroom, so we have a classroom where they're teaching English, they're teaching poetry. I think it'd be absolutely fascinating for them to introduce a poem that has been nominally created by GPT-3. Here's a poem created by a computer. Here's a poem created by a human. What's the difference? What does it mean? What is the impact? If they're the same, then what does that mean about us as humans? I think it could be the starting point for some hugely interesting questions. But in respect to the actual question that the person asked, are there any studies? I'm sorry, I'm not aware. I'm not saying there aren't. I don't know of any studies. Sorry.
It's very interesting to approach it from the perspective of the AI is the product of people's creativity, and then in itself, it almost becomes a form of creative expression and artwork, which is an entirely other webinar that we could do in the future. But Riikka, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I also think so. I don't have an answer to the question, which I really enjoyed, the question of something that we, for example, have already done. But I think what I would say is that I think there is a great place for convergences between these different types of research. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that I was surprised that there hadn't been more research in virtual reality and augmented reality, simulation-based learning in healthcare settings to address issues around discrimination of patients of different gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and so forth, getting different treatment, perceiving a different sense of relationship, with which we know to be a challenge. And from my perspective, as I mentioned, these kinds of technologies would be, would really have an opportunity to help us have situations that are otherwise identical and are just varied on this one notion, to help us uncover the ways in which we perpetuate, sustain and evoke those kinds of inequalities. But I think for us to fully capitalize of those kinds of engagements with the technology and how we move forward, actually, I think bringing people in who work in all kinds of ways with creativities, who work in the arts, would actually be a real addition, because if we knew how to overcome those problems, we would already have done it. Many enough people want to not perpetuate these problems. And like Wayne said, if we knew how to overcome them, we could also code our technology to help us do it. And yet we can't yet. So that thinking at things in a completely new way, looking at them in a completely new light, from my perspective, to bring that to bear in the kind of research we do, might have really huge potential.
Riikka. And Liz, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else can hear in their mind Hal singing Daisy on 2001, although that may just be me. It's interesting, actually, that there was quite a lot of, when Second Life first came out, there was quite a lot of speculation as to whether we could use Second Life, having sort of virtual law schools and play out these sort of scenarios as learning experiences. That hasn't necessarily kind of fulfilled its potential. I think the one comment I heard was, well, there was a virtual law school, but people were at the beach. So I think there is potential in those sort of, simulated environments, sort of safe spaces to play, but whether we can use them in that sort of creative way to address these very real issues is another matter, and whether people would take it seriously as a kind of a simulated experience is obviously another question.
Thank you, Liz. So the subtitle of our session today is The Future of Work, and DEFI is a forward, future-looking organization. So I have a question now that relates to that, and then something that Liz and Wayne have both said. So Liz mentioned a concern that AI may outgun lawyers or make lawyers obsolete. And whilst that seems fodder for a lawyer joke, if we look at it seriously, what is your feeling of that actually happening? And even Wayne quipped that he goes to these conferences or listens to these presentations and they talk 30 seconds about the teacher, but then 30 minutes on how the AI is, or the technology is going to replace that teacher. So the broad question for you as our panelists today is, what professions do you see potentially becoming obsolete or profoundly being reshaped by AI?
I think in relation to the legal profession, we are seeing a lot of changes already. But one of the main things that are happening are that lower level work, so for example, sifting through vast quantities of digital documents in order to identify potential issues, a lot of that is now kind of being devolved down. But part of why that hasn't been quite as revolutionary as it might have been is that actually legal work has had a process of devolving down, being delegated to people like paralegals, legal apprentices anyway. So that's kind of removed one of the drivers for making much more use of AI, which of course was cost, because if you can devolve work down to people who have a certain amount of expertise but a low cost base, do you really then want to make that sort of investment in AI? So I think there will be changes in the legal profession. I think we will make more use of AI, and indeed, Richard Susskind's work is he's recently published on virtual courts, because the court is one area where actually it's very expensive. We need to try and find ways to do it more effectively and more cheaply. But what doesn't seem to be happening is that we're not getting rid of lawyers. We're just getting them to do slightly different things and do their jobs in a slightly different way. So although, yes, it is going to impact on law, I don't see it making us all redundant just yet.
Well, there's been a lot of work on this, right? What jobs are going to go because of AI, and it goes in waves. 1 minute we're going to lose, a third of the working jobs, and the next minute, no, that's not going to happen. Instead, we're going to create twice as many jobs as are lost. I think the reality is that AI is going to have an impact on jobs. I doubt very much it's going to reduce the overall number of jobs, but what it will mean for individuals, though, can be profound. So we might say, well, we lose one level of job, but no worries, because the AI creates another level of a job. But it doesn't mean the person who's lost the job is able to retrain and take on the new job. So for individual people, this could be really quite difficult for them, their personal circumstances. So when the the AI advocates exclaim, AI is going to increase jobs rather than reduce them, that still doesn't deal with the real problems that this might actually happen. But I do think, one possible thing that might happen is that people who deal with people, who are harder to replicate with an AI system, are going to be more secure in their jobs rather than people who deal with numbers. So I think accountants probably have more of a problem than shop workers or people who run restaurants, for example. But at the end of the day, what is the impact on people? I think it's going to be changing by the year. We just don't really know. And the big question for me is, You know, and I think I know the answer, is AI really going to lead to a time when we're only working, 20-hour weeks or less? As I say, I suspect not. It's never happened with the introduction of any technology so far. So why, with the introduction of AI, will it do any more? And I think partly that's because of this accumulation of AI power by such a small number of huge players, that's going to change things in not necessarily good ways.
Thank you, Wayne. So we only have a few minutes left of the webinar today. And so I have a closing question for all of you. And this has been a fascinating discussion, and it has certainly highlighted that perceptions and opinions of AI are rife with polemics, that you can have very positive and negative perceptions of AI. So my closing question for all of you is, what excites you most about AI and what worries you the most about AI? Riikka, go ahead.
Just briefly then, I think probably the answer to the two might be linked. So one of the things that excites me as someone who works in trying to improve equity in education and in society more widely is the new opportunities in various different kinds through all the kind of three buckets that Wayne described and the fourth one that I proposed, to help us find new ways to deal with some of the challenges that we currently know we face, but we don't quite know why we face them and how we might move beyond them to help us innovate, not just in terms of the technology itself, but in terms of social equity. And I guess what worries me most is the potential, for all the kinds of reasons that Wayne and Liz and others have spoken about today, is the narrowing down, not just the narrowing down of education, but narrowing down our thinking, our actions, our opportunities, and narrowing down the control over us that might at the same time limit our opportunity to innovate and to envision alternative futures and enact upon those visions.
Riikka and Liz, please share.
Okay, I think I'll start with what makes me a bit nervous. We've touched on this idea of a digital divide, and digital poverty is something which is being discussed a great deal. And what does concern me is, as things get more sophisticated, are we going to perpetuate those divides? Are those divides going to become worse? I think in terms of what excites me about it is that I feel at the moment that we've only scratched the surface, that there are potentials. I mean, Wayne's made the point that, we don't have evidence about what it can do. We don't necessarily have, information which is going to help us use it better. But there is a lot of potential here. We could do exciting things with this. I just hope that they're the right exciting things and that they're going to enable us to close those gaps rather than widening them.
Thank you, Liz. And Wayne, do you have any closing thoughts?
Sorry, we got another 2 hours. I think what excites me, I think, is there is potential for using AI to do things that do improve equity, that do improve diversity, that do improve inclusion, that do improve educational outcomes, but just not what we've got at the moment. One example, if we talk about a developing country, rural area that don't have qualified teachers, often the argument is, well, let's put an AI tool in there and that'll sort that, and it really doesn't. Actually using AI in the back end to support the adults there to become more experienced and experts in teaching and learning, that could help. So it's about shifting the direction of the AI. What frightens me about AI is, I think it's the accumulation of power. And I think that is the biggest worry for the future of humankind. With people like Mark Zuckerberg in charge, yeah, I worry daily.
Thank you, Wayne. And thank you all. You have been an excellent panel. You've made my job very easy. And this has been a really fascinating discussion, and it's only indicated that we need to keep diving into this idea and continue exploring the role of AI in education. So thank you for coming today and participating in the webinar, and thank you to all of our attendees and for joining no matter where you are in the world. You can see that Barry has put up a slide here that shows you how you can get in contact with DEFI, and please keep an eye out for future webinars. So thank you all for coming this evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.